Welcome to Coffee with Catholic Workers, a podcast made by and for Catholic workers. I'm Theo.
And I'm Lydia. We've both been a part of Catholic Worker for the last decade or so, and we're excited to bring to you conversations with Catholic workers from around the country and around the world.
This is our final installment in a three-part series on labor within the Catholic worker movement. Joe Kruse joins us today from Minneapolis. Joe grew up connected to the Catholic worker, helped start the Minneapolis Catholic Worker, and has participated in unionized labor in his workplace.
So we'll go right to Joe. Well, Joe, could you maybe introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your connection to the Catholic worker movement?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Joe Kruse, and I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And my connection to the Catholic worker started when I was pretty young. When I was like 8 or 9, my parents started a Catholic worker community in the town I grew up in, La Crosse, Wisconsin, with a group of their friends. And it wasn't like a community house that we lived in. It was in a house on the south side of La Crosse, and it was kind of like just like an informal, like Catholic worker style soup kitchen. They did like 2 or 3 meals a week. So we went there regularly. So like that was kind of a part of our family's like weekly rhythm, was going to that Catholic worker house. It's called Place of Grace, and it's still around today. And yeah, and it was just it became very much a part of the Catholic worker kind of like ethos, was like in the backdrop of my childhood, and was interwoven to my understanding of our family's Catholicism. But it was like this taken for granted thing that I didn't fully explore, obviously, really, when I was a kid or when I was in high school. It was just like I knew Dorothy. I knew the name Dorothy Day. I knew that we had a Catholic worker in town and that I went to it a lot. But like the history and the depth and the fact that it was like this, global thing, I wasn't really aware of. So I have roots in the Catholic worker in that way. And then in my early 20s, I went to what brought me to Minneapolis was going to school at the U of M, going to undergrad there. And when I graduated from college, kind of my last 2 years of school, kind of rediscovered the Catholic worker, or just dove into it for the first time, really. And it was that process. It's kind of a long story, but it was like connected to my own personal development of my own spirituality, and trying to like reconcile my developing political beliefs with my faith tradition. And the Catholic worker really helped me, rediscovering the Catholic worker really helped me make that connection and that reconciliation happen. So my early 20s like really dove in hard to the Catholic worker world, and basically became convinced that I was like, this is the thing that I want to do at this time in my life. So then when I finished undergrad, went on a road trip with a few friends all over the country, visiting Catholic worker communities and other kind of like intentional Christian communities, kind of into like new monastic wave that was like happening around that time. Yeah, and then on that, and my thought at that point was like, I'm gonna find a community that needs help, or maybe I could find a place in for a while. But on that trip, and kind of conversing with the friends I was traveling with, we made the decision, for better or for worse, to start a community in Minneapolis, a Catholic worker type community in Minneapolis. And at that point, Minneapolis didn't have like a Catholic worker. There were similar communities, like the Mennonite worker at that time was known as Missio Dei. That was around very much in the Catholic worker kind of ethos. And there had been a Catholic worker there in years in the past. but at that time there wasn't, and I had connections there, and a few of my friends had connections in Minneapolis. So yeah, so then moved back to Minneapolis, and this would have been like 2012, I think, and then started the what we called the Rye House community at that point. And then did that, and then the Rye House, and then we eventually started to call it the Minneapolis Catholic Worker, and that was like for almost 8-9 years. That was kind of like what I dedicated myself to, um, up until the pandemic, basically, and then my life changed a lot. um, so that's that I know that was a long answer to your question, but that's kind of like that's my roots in the Catholic Worker.
We're used to those long answers for
I know.
short
I'm gonna try to.
questions.
I want to break the mold and give you all short, concise answers. That's my goal.
No, I feel like we did have one guest who, like, when I was talking to them, they're like, felt like they were talking too long. But it's like, no, everything you're saying is very interesting and stuff, you know. So you've had a particular interest in thinking about like the Catholic worker and Catholic worker thought as it relates to labor in recent years, right? Can you lay some of that out for us, and particularly for folks who don't know that history or don't know some of that thought?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So oh, I'm trying to think of where to start. So I think like in the past, throughout the past maybe like 5-6 years, I just personally have uh gotten increasingly engaged in the labor movement in Minneapolis, and in thinking about and trying to understand the labor movement and what unions are and what they do, um and I was in a union for several years when I was working as a butcher at a grocery store. I was a part of United Food and Commercial Workers. Our local was 663. So plugged into the union world kind of through my union, and then I also connected to some like local organizations in the Twin Cities who do work in the labor world. Like I went for a while to like the DSA, the Twin Cities DSA labor branch meetings, and then there was like like a group of people who were very connected to the IWW, who I've connected with, and I went to a couple IWW meetings as well. So yeah, so just personally, like I was becoming increasingly interested in the labor movement, and then like politically, I think I was also experiencing a shift, and just my own understanding of like capitalism and racial capitalism, and how racism and patriarchy and sexism are all connected to our economic system, and that like you can't really uncouple those things, like, you know what I mean, like you can't really have you couldn't work for an anti-racist world or a world free from racism without also confronting and working to undo capitalism. And then the same is true. Like you obviously can't, confront capitalism without adequately addressing racism, for example. So becoming more aware of like the ways in which those things are connected, and understanding class and class tension, um, and conflict in a new way, was all a part of that. It was also my growing kind of politicization around the economy was also a part of kind of what was bringing me into the labor movement in a deeper way. So that was happening while I was still part of and living at the Minneapolis Catholic Worker. And I think at that time I was kind of dismayed by the fact that like, um my experience of the Catholic Worker was one in which I was very like plugged into various social movements and, participating in a lot of activism, doing a lot of like one-off, direct actions and civil disobedience and all that sort of like bread and butter of the Catholic worker world that I knew. And there was very little, if any, connection between the Catholic worker and the labor movement, in my experience. And I know that that's not fully true. There are Catholic worker communities who have been connected to the labor movement in significant ways for a very long time and continue to be in like our contemporary time. But like by and large, at least the Catholic worker that I was experiencing didn't seem to be super connected to the labor movement or really like, working class people in a super significant way. And so that like disconnection I found to be really interesting. And it kind of like led me to do some of my own just like personal research on the Catholic workers' connection to the labor movement. And as I learned, and I think most people who have looked into Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker probably already know, is like there's a deep and rich relationship between the Catholic worker and the labor movement, especially in the early days of the movement. Like in the 30s and the 40s, arguably that was like the Catholic workers' kind of primary focus. Dorothy Day's maybe primary focus was on the labor movement. Like the first issue of the Catholic Worker, I think most of the articles in it were focused on different labor struggles. And then a lot of the early activism of the Catholic worker was in solidarity with workers who are on strike or participating in various like labor struggles. Like there's all sorts of like really cool examples of how like early Catholic worker was plugged into the labor movement. And then I think, and I don't know if this is maybe going too far down a rabbit hole, but I think that the Catholic worker, as it kind of expanded and as the political climate in our country changed, I think the emphasis on both like anti-war activism and like the kind of emergence of like what became to be known as like the New Left, and then also like the agrarian kind of emphasis, the Catholic worker emphasis on like the agrarian communities. I think those kind of factors all combine to like lessen the Catholic workers' connection to the labor movement in some ways. And that's kind of that's like a theory almost that I've been playing around with, like trying to answer this question, like why is it that I was a member of the Catholic worker for 8 years and was never invited through the Catholic worker world to like walk a picket line, right? Like why was that the case? Whereas if I would have become a Catholic worker in 1935, that would have been a primary like thing I would have been doing. So I'm like trying to answer, and I don't know really what the answer is. Like why is that reality? Why is that the case? And I think that's my guess is like the kind of just like shifting emphasis of the worker generally. So I don't know if that yeah, this is kind of rambly. I'm not sure if that covers exactly what you're looking for, or if you want me to kind of expound on any of that.
I think that's helpful. I also wonder, I don't know off the top of my head that I could throw out numbers, but I also believe that during the time the Catholic workers started compared to mid-2000s, there was a much higher percentage of the workforce also in unions.
Totally.
Is that accurate?
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to throw out estimates of numbers though.
No, I think that's right. I think it was like a third of all Americans during that time were in unions from like the beginning of the 20th century up into the 60s and 70s. And now that's much smaller. I don't know what, I think it's like 9 or I forget. It's like it's a much smaller amount of unionized workers. So I think that's definitely a part of it. It's just like it was like a bigger piece of like the national kind of political scene. And then also it was and not only that, but it was like, in addition to that, the labor struggles that were happening were like very uh like big. A lot of them were very big and like radical and like threatening to the, especially in the 30s, to like the established economic order. So I imagine if you were alive and like, on the left or whatever during that time, the labor movement was like the center of gravity, would be my guess.
Could you talk maybe a little bit about like what is labor in general, especially like from like a Catholic worker perspective? What is this idea of labor and why is it important to the Catholic worker?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, so Dorothy Day writes a lot about labor, and she obviously is very impacted by like Catholic social teaching. So a lot of the ways in which she writes about labor, um, and I think especially like the early Catholic workers thought about labor was in the context of like these really significant, important Catholic uh like papal encyclicals like Rerum Novarum, the one that Pope Pius wrote that I can't pronounce the name of it. It's like Quadraciano or something like that. And these were encyclicals that, one, like, my understanding, very firmly put the Catholic Church kind of like on the side of organized labor. I mean, they were in those encyclicals, they were critical of very critical of both capitalism and communism, and tried to like, find this like third way between those two economic orders. Uh, and a lot of those encyclicals went to lengths to like ensure people that the Catholic Church is not like communist or socialist organization or entity, but the Catholic Church does like stand with workers' right to organize collectively on the job to like fight for better working conditions against their employer, and the capitalists who own their production. Uh, so so Dorothy and the early Catholic workers were really influenced by these encyclicals. And then another, to answer your question, another aspect of these encyclicals were kind of emphasizing like the like dignity of labor, that like labor and working with our hands is like this sacred duty that human beings have, and that when we do that, our labor is a holy thing that helps God co-create the world. Like, we co-create the world with God with our work. And so for them, like, work isn't just, if work just becomes this like this the means that we use to like, get a paycheck and eat food, or pay for our our lives, and that's all that it is, that it's just kind of this thing that we have to do, then it is like, we are not living into the full potential of what God wants our labor to be. Like, God wants our labor to be this thing that's like generative and life-giving, and not like soul crushing. So that kind of was like undergirding their, I think, partially undergirding their involvement in the labor movement was like uh the Industrial Revolution kind of resulted in a lot of jobs that were like very unsafe, degrading, monotonous, and they saw, and then like very exploited, like crappy pay, um just like all, generally just like very exploitative working conditions. And so I think Dorothy Day and the early Catholic workers saw this as like an affront to God's God's intention of what work should be. And so plugging into the labor movement and fighting for better working conditions with the working class is working towards the God's intention of what work should be. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, the dignity of work and like kind of the sacredness of labor was a big theological, like I don't know, a big theological center of gravity for Dorothy and the Catholic workers during that time. And I think it's like, isn't there a part of the aims and means that's like about labor, and it kind of says that in a much better way than I just did. But I think that's, was and I think for a lot of Catholic workers probably still is a big component of what the Catholic workers should be about.
And so what is the current relevance in the moment for labor? I mean, you could look historically of like these large like railroad strikes or miners' strikes and
Right.
these very huge national labor movements. But what is sort of the importance of the moment now for our listeners to know about labor movements or to be aware of or supportive of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a few thoughts that come to mind for me. One is that I do think that there hasn't been a super significant uptick in the amount of people in unions in like recent years. There has been some, but it's not like huge. I do think what is true, however, is that people have been engaging in workplace organizing, and I think there's been like a politicization of workers and working class people in recent years that is very significant and really important. And that kind of that action doesn't necessarily happen under the umbrella of like capital U unions, like like these, the organizations that we think of when we hear the word unions, like various union locals, unions associated with the AFL-CIO. I think that there's been a lot of more informal, decentralized organization of workers that maybe isn't necessarily under the auspices of like kind of the official union structures. That's really exploded. I think during the pandemic, we saw that in all kinds of sectors of the workforce. And I think that, there was was it last year during the fall, there was a whole bunch of strikes going on. So I do think there is this, I think the pandemic kind of brought to the, similar in some ways to maybe the 30s and what the Great Depression did for the heightening of of class conflict. I think the pandemic did this, played a similar role in recent years of really highlighting the egregious inequality in our country. And I mean, the fact that, the CEOs and the highest earners in our country continued to make record profit. And I think some or many of them, during the pandemic, actually made more money. Well, working class people were being forced to stay on the job. Many of them died because of that. There was the situation where if you were a parent and you had to work, and your kid got sick or had an exposure at school, then you were somehow supposed to continue to work and also stay home with your sick kid or quarantine kid. Also all these impossible contradictions were kind of coming to a head during those years. And I think that really radicalized a lot of people or politicized a lot of people and made the contradictions of capitalism very apparent. You just can't ignore it. A lot of people, I just feel couldn't ignore it anymore. And I think it drove a lot of people to organize, talk to their coworkers, organize with their coworkers, and start to push back against some of that. So to answer you, so back to your question, I feel like I have hope that we're in a moment of like increasing class consciousness. And I think, people in the Catholic worker, I think this is like a great opportunity to connect with some of that energy, and to plug into unions and to support workers who are struggling for better working conditions on the job. I feel like this is an important time to do that. And then the other thing I'll say is another thing that kind of drew me to the labor movement and just to like organizing on at my work was, I think that there is a lot of ways in which people these days are divided from each other. And I think some of that division is like inevitable, even important. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not trying to say like, oh, we should go hang out with, whatever, neo-Nazis or something, or people who are, very who advocate for like the extermination of certain groups of people. But I think there is a lot of ways in which capitalists and like kind of the economic elite have divided the working class, unnecessarily divided the working class. And I think the labor movement can be, and I think it's tragically failed at this in a lot of circumstances, but I think there's a way in which the labor movement can be a thing that like brings groups of people together that need to be working together in order for like the kind of death march of capitalism to be like curbed. Like, you know what I mean? Like we need people with like different ideological bents. We need people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds to be coming together with each other in solidarity if there's any hope of changing the course that we're on. And I feel like in my experience, the labor movement is a better vehicle for that than like some of the more kind of insular, often like anarchist activist scenes that I personally have been a part of. And not to like disparage that milieu of folks, like, and I'm have been, and in some ways still am, very much a part of that. And there's been a lot of good work that comes out of that, like kind of activist mentality and ethos. But I feel like right now I'm more excited and hopeful about organizing that's like where I am connected to more regular everyday people who I maybe don't agree with on every single aspect of like my politics. You know what I mean? Like that to me is, I feel like where I need to be focusing my energy. And then I would, I think argue that I think we need more Catholic workers in that space as well. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I feel like that's kind of during this time where it feels like there's just so much division of the working class. I feel like the labor movement and focusing my energy on the labor movement is maybe a place where some of that division can be overcome, which is necessary if we're gonna win.
So what does winning look like? I mean, you mentioned work being sacred, work being generative. What is that dream that we're moving towards?
Oh, that's so good. Such a good question, Lydia. That's a good one. I don't know. And I feel like there is a there are like, for me, so many different levels of an answer to that. Like, on the one hand, like I mean, I just would love it if my kids could grow up in a world where they don't have to like worry about the fact that like a medical bill could bankrupt them. You know what I mean? Like, so on the one hand, I'm like, winning would be like, maybe capitalism isn't abolished, but at least we have, a decent minimum wage, universal health care, like these kind of like these policies and aspects of society that a lot of countries in the world already do have. So that would be sweet. On that, in one sense, that would be winning. But I think in like a deeper sense, and and this is maybe a more spiritual sense for me, is like exactly what you said. Like winning would be a world where work is like holy and is not a part of a system that is based on exploitation, that requires exploitation of workers in order to function. And so that obviously would be like the abolition of racial capitalism, and capitalism that functions, off of all sorts of oppressions of groups of people. So I feel like that would be another way in which I could think about what winning would look like. But obviously that's far off. That's far off. But I think part of my like spirituality and faith is that I have this. I try to cultivate a belief that it's possible. At all times, I try to believe that, even when it's really, really hard.
And isn't that like the illogical piece of the Catholic worker and
Yeah.
Christianity in general, that redemption is somehow possible and we're
Yep.
moving towards it?
Totally. Even when we fail all the time, it's still possible.
Well, other things that you want to highlight, things we haven't touched on about labor that would be important for us to think about.
I think maybe one thing I do want to add, because I want to go back to this piece just for a second of like the the labor movement being a place that that I think could kind of bring people together that need to be working together in order for capitalism to be curtailed or destroyed. So going back to that piece, like I think it's important to name that the labor movement, well I do think that's true. The labor movement historically, and especially in its more formal kind of form, like in these organizations that people in the IWW would call like business unions, like these bureaucratic labor structures that have taken shape, kind of like in the wake of workers organizing themselves. There have been times in history where the labor movement, and particularly these organizations, have participated in the division of groups of people, especially around race. Like, there have been a lot of unfortunately, tragically, like very, very racist labor union leaders who have maybe not allowed certain ethnic or racial groups of people into their unions. So there is this history, this very tragic history, where the labor movement has participated in, instead of working to like build solidarity amongst different groups of people, have participated in white supremacy, and kind of upheld that, that system. So I just want to name that like it's not like the labor movement is like it's not like the labor movement isn't guilty of participating in systems of racism and sexism and patriarchy, and but I think but then I think there are a lot of examples of ways that organizing around work and around class and economics has brought groups of people together in a way that does combat white supremacy. Like a really good example is like, and this is a history I don't know a ton about, but the meat cutters union in Chicago and in Milwaukee during like the 40s to the 60s, it was a very multiracial industry. And the union was like very, for the time, very radical in its like stance of the ways in which it combated racism on the job, and in its leadership structure was diverse. And so there have been times in history where the labor movement has done a good job in building that solidarity in a real way. So yeah, so I just want to just name that it's the history is complicated, and it's not like the labor movement is immune to to racism and other forms of identity oppression, for sure.
Yeah, it seems like it's the story of every organization that seeks to do good.
Of course, yeah.
That we all have our struggles at some point.
Totally. Yeah, no,
Well,
it's so true.
thanks so much, Joe, for joining us. I think Theo's been having some connection problems, so he's periodically been dropping and coming back. I don't actually know if he's still on the call at this point. But yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk about labor, in part because it had played such a large part of the Catholic worker, and it really isn't a piece that I think we have the same focus on today.
Totally. Yeah. No, I agree with you. And there's so many cool stories about the Catholic workers' involvement in the labor movement in those early years that I highly recommend people check out. I mean, Dorothy wrote a lot about them. It's easy to find. But yeah, my hope would be that the Catholic worker movement becomes a place where the labor movement and connecting with labor struggles is like as prevalent as engagement in anti-war protests, for example.
Good stuff.
Good stuff.
Well, I'm sorry, Theo, that you were having some connectivity issues during Joe's interview.
Yeah, it's a bummer, but luckily it got recorded, and now I can listen to it over and over again on the Coffee with Catholic Workers podcast.
You've got it on repeat, right? Just playing it all day long to really absorb Joe's thoughts on labor.
It's in the mix. Basically, I just listen all the way through the catalog and then start over again. So it'll become part of the rotation.
Nice. Well, I really appreciated talking with Joe. I really liked the grounding that he brought. I feel like the series has been a lot of fun of pulling some of like the historical aspects and the theoretical aspects, and now this was like, okay, but what does it like really mean? What does it look like? This intersection of both like labor and human lives.
Yeah, I think as I reflected on talking to Joe, one thing that stood out to me is that he talked about that he himself was a unionized worker. He was a meat cutter and part of his union as such. And I think that that's maybe something that is missing from a lot of Catholic workers' lives, is that there is this difference between being a Catholic worker, as is most often experienced by those in the movement, and being a worker, like being somebody who has to earn their living with their time and labor under capitalism. And I think it does lead us to different understandings to be a worker than we will have to be a Catholic worker, as it is currently manifest mostly in the movement. So it's kind of been Theo's hot take for a little while, and I'm going to give my hot take right now, that more Catholic workers should spend more time working at places like being a meat cutter or something like that. During the pandemic, I spent some time away from the movement and kind of had a normal job, and I worked at Target for a while. It was one of the places I worked, and it was way interesting to be in that position as a worker instead of a Catholic worker, and particularly during the beginning of the pandemic and stuff. But it was like the experiences of Catholic workers who are like their own bosses was different than that of workers who were forced to continue to work in unsafe conditions, you know? Even just like being sick at a Catholic worker is different than being sick as a wage laborer. You know, I can just stay home from the soup kitchen and hopefully everyone else will pick up the slack. But you might get in trouble at your workplace for just trying to take a sick day. You might not get paid for not being there, which is a burden for so many folks. And just like being in relationship to workers is different when you are amongst them rather than like in a Catholic worker position of like leading a quasi charitable organization is what it looks like sometimes, you know. So I think that there is a lot to learn for Catholic workers to have a job and to be in real relationship with workers elsewhere. And I think that that's like a perspective that Joe had that not that some other Catholic workers don't, and that he spoke about, which we have not really heard about on the podcast
Yeah, yeah. It is interesting sometimes the lack of intersection. I think both Rosalie and Lincoln referenced it somewhat of the way that the Catholic worker as a movement has moved away from, in particular, the labor movement, and in some ways in its focus on the worker or labor in general. And I'm definitely someone who's sort of guilty of that. I work, but I mostly, besides, well, I guess there was like several years in my like teen years that I picked strawberries with like migrant workers. But beyond that, I've always worked white collar jobs, very different from the idea of the worker in what Dorothy and Peter were starting with.
Yeah, that's something Brian Terrell talks about sometimes, and I'm sure we'll have him on the show if we stick around long enough. But that nowadays there's like a lot of grad school student type people in the movement compared to before. Like a lot of people have master's degrees, if you know, and stuff, or maybe even just a undergrad degree. But that it used to be, yeah, a lot more working class. It was not as educated. It wasn't quite from those same backgrounds. And so, will we inevitably think about labor less if the folks joining the Catholic worker movement aren't from a labor background, aren't from families that of laborers and stuff? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, proportionally, more of the US population has undergraduate degrees than, I guess, if we were to look back decades ago. But yeah, it is true. It's a different type of, it's a different category of person that the worker begins attracting with that. I don't really know. I don't really know what that means or where to go with that.
Yeah, it's hard to know where to go with it because we're kind of where we are. Um, but one thing kind of related that maybe the one line that I took away the most from Joe's conversation was he mentioned that in the Catholic worker movement, he was like never out on a picket line. He was never invited out on a picket line. And there have been Catholic workers in modern times doing that from time to time for sure. But I think it's a mostly true observation, and it's not one I've ever thought about. I don't know if I mentioned it on the Theo episode we recorded a while back, but like I grew up in like a union household, so like growing up, I did go to picket lines when the grocery store workers were on strike, when the strawberry workers wanted support. Uh, we were out on the picket line as kids and stuff, and that was educational and transformative. Um, and it did make me just reflect that I'm part of this group that is like kind of seeking a more just world, but that thing going to support striking workers has not been in recent times a major part of the movement, though it has been in my life before coming to the Catholic Worker.
Interesting. Well, maybe that's something we'll have to think about, or that we'll have to ask all of you, our listeners, to think about, of in what ways can your Catholic workers, your Catholic worker houses or farms, or your friends who share similar thought can become more involved either in organized labor or in the shifting the idea of labor and work. Because it's sort of these two different things, like labor as this organized labor movement and labor as this idea of what it means to work. One of the things I really appreciated that Joe talked about was this idea of like work being sacred and labor being sacred, with this idea that we're not pushing away from work. Anybody within a Catholic worker community knows that it's a lot of work. Even creating this podcast is a lot of work, but that there's this creativeness to it is sacred. It's sort of what humanity was created to do, to work and create.
I think that's a wonderful reflection to end this 3-part series on.
Great. Well, then that wraps up for us our series on labor. If you want to reach out to us with any comments, suggestions, or clarification of thought, you can always reach out to us at our email, which is coffeewithcatholicworkers@gmail.com. We want to thank Chris from the Bloomington Catholic Worker with help editing, David Hayes for our music, Becky McIntyre for our graphic.
Thanks for joining us again for some clarification of thought. We hope today's conversation and discussion have been enlightening, and maybe even that you're encouraged to go out and help build a world where it's easier to be good.